So for our final keynote, I think it pairs really nicely with Rennie's that we had this morning. Carissa is going to be presenting on religious diversity in science, insights from psychological research on science and belief in society. So Carissa is a psychologist of religion, primarily focusing on people's perceptions of the relationship between science and religion and how people think about God. And she's assistant professor in psychology of religion at the University of Birmingham. She's previously held positions at the University of Oregon, Coventry University, and most recently Newman University, where she was Associate Director of the Centre for Science, Knowledge and Belief in Society. Carissa is currently co-investigator of the Science and Religion Exploring the Spectrum of Global Perspectives project and co-principal investigator of the International Research Network for the Study of Science and Belief in Society. So with all that bearing all of that in mind, we're delighted to welcome you to SRF, Carissa, and over to you when you're ready.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Finley. As Finley said, today I'm going to talk about religious diversity in science and pulling on kind of a program of research that I've been doing with my colleagues on science and belief in society. So I want to start with some context and kind of make a case study for why it's important to think about diversity in science as a topic. And I'm just going to talk about, first of all, the importance of science in culture. So if we take the UK as a case study, we have quotes from politicians 20 years apart talking about the importance of science to British identity. So you have Tony Blair in 2002 saying Newton and Darwin are acknowledged as two of the epical scientists of human civilization and are probably, with Shakespeare, Britain's greatest contributors to human civilization. And then you have Boris Johnson 2 decades later saying, I cannot think of a time in the last 100 years when the entire population of this country has been so deeply and so obviously indebted to science and to scientists. So you can see this real kind of effort of aligning kind of British identity and politics and science together as something that is acknowledged as being kind of politically expedient, right, for these figures. So that's kind of a larger narrative about science in society, but what does the public say? Well, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the public is also very honed in on science as being important in terms of making our lives healthier, easier, and more comfortable, that medical research will improve our quality of life. There's overall trust in scientists, even scientists who don't work in academia, but work in like the commercial industries and things like that, right? So there's a real kind of British kind of acceptance of science and acceptance of the importance of science through various kinds of methods of looking at this on a societal scale. Now, in addition to this kind of evidence for the importance of science in society, you also have kind of parallel to that, the rise of non-religious identities in the UK. There's a steady increase of people identifying as non-religious, and many of those non-religious people have identities, non-religious identities, that are centered around being pro-science and anti-religious, kind of rejecting any kind of spirituality, spiritual viewpoints, those kinds of things. And you also have this narrative of religion as kind of science's ultimate other, and this kind of general assumption that religious people will necessarily reject science as the kind of conflict narrative about science and belief in society. So where does this leave religious people then, right? They're part of British society. Can they be included in science, something which we've just argued is so important to the British public? And so here is where I want to identify our big problem for today, which is the lack of religious diversity in STEM fields. So science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. And I also want to reiterate, this is not just a problem in the UK. In the majority of country contexts that have been studied, scientists tend to be less religious than the general public. And just to give you some stats, to be honest, these are quite old stats now, but in the UK in 2014, they found that 47% of the general public were religious in this particular survey, but only 27% of scientists were. So you can see there's a huge mismatch there in terms of religious people being underrepresented in the sciences. So why is this important? To be honest, I probably don't really need to make this case too much to this particular audience, but I'll make the case anyway, and I'll make several cases for this. So the first is a business case, which is that diversity just generally makes science better. You get different perspectives, you get different kind of focuses, and currently we have a lack of people in various demographics engaging with STEM. So it's not just a problem of religiosity, but I'm a psychologist of religion. I'm going to be focusing on religiosity in this particular talk. But I just want to kind of acknowledge that there are lots of different identities where, you know, there is underrepresentation in STEM as well. So that's the business case. There's also a social justice case, which is just basically, it's unfair, right? It's unfair to exclude certain voices, certain identities from STEM, to not reflect the diversity that's in our societies. And then also, you know, STEM fields are often associated with opportunity. So, you know, if there's lack of representation, that's also meaning that you're not extending those opportunities to everyone equally. And then finally, a public understanding of science case, which is that increasing diversity in STEM will hopefully increase engagement with and investment in science for everyone. And, you know, as we've seen from recent world events like the pandemic, public understanding of science and engagement with science and trust in science are incredibly important in terms of tackling, you know, various societal problems that come around all the time. So what I'd like to do in the rest of this talk is go through some potential explanations for this underrepresentation. Because I think the most important thing in the first instance is to figure out what's going on, right? Why is it that religious people are underrepresented in STEM? And that can help us figure out how to address this societal issue. So I'm going to talk about three potential explanations in this talk. The first of these is that religious people see a conflict between science and religion, right? So if religious people see a conflict between science and religion, maybe they're just less invested in science, they're just less likely to go into scientific fields. The second potential explanation is that religious people see identifying as both religious and a scientist as kind of a surprising or counter-stereotypical combination of identities. So it's not quite the same as the first potential explanation, which is more about kind of people's belief systems. This is more about people not being able to reconcile identities of being religious and being a scientist. And then the third potential explanation is that the culture of science is discouraging religious individuals from going into STEM fields. So just a really brief introduction to the research I'm going to be talking about today. It's all coming, well, primarily coming from two large projects that I've been involved in since 2014 now. It's been quite a while. So the first of these projects was Science and Religion Exploring the Spectrum, or SRES-1, as we call it, which was looking at the top level question, what social and cultural factors have driven and are currently driving the narrative in the public domain that there is a necessary clash between religious belief and acceptance of evolutionary science? Sorry for very, very long top level question, but, and I was part of a very large team looking at this from different perspectives. So we had people doing qualitative interviews, people doing kind of historical analysis and media discourse analysis, large-scale polling and quantitative surveys, and then I was doing social psychology research, overseen by Fern Elsden-Baker, who is the PI of the project, and working with my colleague Carola Leicht at the University of Kent. So I'm mostly going to be just pulling from this social psychological research for this presentation today, but just to know that there's a lot of different kind of interesting perspectives that have kind of fed into the larger kind of conversation about this. Following on from SRES 1, we did SRES 2, which was Science and Religion Exploring the Spectrum, Global Perspectives. So we had the same strands of research, but we expanded that research to different country contexts. Instead of just focusing on the UK and Canada, for the psychological research strand, which is what I'm going to talk about today, we expanded to the UK, Germany, Spain, Argentina, and Sri Lanka. And we didn't want to just parachute in and, you know, bring our own assumptions from not being really embedded in those country contexts. So we were working with qualitative researchers on the ground in each of those countries to develop the research, to make sure that we weren't kind of bringing our own assumptions to the table and that kind of thing, that we were really doing research that was embedded in the local context. So that's a very brief overview of the research I'll be talking about today. So some of the research you'll see is kind of UK based primarily, and then I'll sometimes open it up to a more kind of global scale with our research that was done in different countries. So let's tackle this first explanation here, the explanation that religious people see a conflict between science and religion, and that is why they're underrepresented in science. Well, first I'm going to actually pull from that large-scale quantitative work from SRES 1, where my colleagues did a representative survey looking at people's difficulty of accepting evolutionary science. So the question is, how easy or difficult do you find it to accept evolutionary science in reference to your personal beliefs? And so these are just the religious or spiritual respondents in the UK and Canada. And as you can see, there's far more green than red on these pie charts, indicating that most people don't find it difficult. Most religious or spiritual people don't find it difficult to kind of reconcile evolutionary science and their personal beliefs. And, you know, with a focus on evolution, which is obviously one of these key flashpoints in the sciences, where you hear a lot of this kind of conflict narrative around that. So the fact that we found, you know, fairly low percentages, even when focusing specifically on evolution, is really kind of an indication that it's not a massive chunk of the religious or spiritual population that are seeing there being a problem with science and religion. Additionally, my colleagues and I worked on a scale to try and find out whether we could kind of separate out different ways of thinking about science and religion. So whether, you know, different kind of issues would be seen as being kind of more conflicting or less conflicting. So can we talk about science and religion as kind of monolithic entities, or do we need to think about more specific issues, right? And what we found is that we could really distinguish between two subscales here, if you will. So we've got the explanation subscale, which is really these kind of big picture questions about the origins of human life and the origins of the universe, what happens at the end of human life, those kinds of things. So the question was, how much do you view science and religion as in conflict or compatible with regards to these issues, right? And then we had another cluster of items that were related to kind of human interactions with the world, if you will. So things like treating physical and mental illness, explaining why people get sick, informing the relationship between humans and the environment, those kinds of things, right? So really those kind of more day-to-day practical types of issues that come up with regards to science and religion. And what we found when we looked at different religious identities here is that religious people, so this is on this scale, 0 is conflict, and then higher numbers, so 7 up there is compatibility. So we found that religious people saw more compatibility between science and religion than agnostics or atheists. And we also saw that across all of our participant groups, people saw more compatibility with regards to those more kind of day-to-day practical questions than they did for those kind of big picture explanations questions. Those questions were really where we saw the most conflict, perceptions of conflict. So this is just data from the UK. The question was, would this work outside of the UK? So we replicated this work in our SRES 2 countries. So I'm going to show you the data from the UK, Germany, Spain, Argentina, and I don't think I have Sri Lanka on. Oh no, I do have Sri Lanka. Yes, sorry. And again, we worked with our partners in those countries to make sure that all the wording made sense in that context and everything. And then we made sure that we were asking about participant groups, again, that made sense for that particular context. So we'd found in SRES 1 that splitting people into kind of religious, non-religious, and atheist, so specifically atheist, rather than just kind of generally non-religious, made a huge difference in terms of explaining patterns of results. So we find that those three groups of people really seem to kind of, splitting kind of a general population into those three groups of people really has a lot of explanatory power in terms of looking at different patterns of belief and behavior and that kind of thing. So we wanted to see kind of, with that as a starting point, could we use that in the different countries we were looking at? So we kept those three categories for the UK, Germany, and Spain. But in Argentina, they said atheist is just not a large enough kind of percentage of the population here. It's not as much of a kind of part of the cultural narrative. So we just had two groups there, religious and non-religious. And then in Sri Lanka, again, there wasn't really any point in asking people who were non-religious, because there was just such a tiny portion of the population that would be non-religious. So we focused on the four largest religious groups there, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, and Christian. And when we asked people about these questions, when we had them fill out this scale, we found that the two-factor scale worked really well in each of those contexts. So sorry for the really small graphs here, but as you can see, we're finding a very similar pattern across Argentina, Germany, and Spain, where the religious people on the left are seeing more compatibility than the non-religious and atheist for Germany and Spain people on the right. And in addition, you can see that there's this clear distinction between the two different types of questions, the explanations questions and the human world interactions questions, in the same way that we found in the UK. The Sri Lanka data was actually slightly different, which was very interesting. So we found for our Muslim and Christian participants that we found this parallel, difference between the explanations and human world interactions questions for those two participant groups. But actually for the Buddhist and the Hindu groups, we didn't find any difference in how they were answering those two types of questions. So it's a really interesting finding that we haven't had a chance to really delve into yet, but we're, wondering if there's something to do with kind of, narratives within the religious tradition, them not being Abrahamic traditions. There might be some different kind of narratives going on about science and belief. So that's something that we're hoping to delve into further in coming research. But overall, what we can say from this program of research looking at perceptions of the relationship between science and religion is that religious individuals on average actually perceive science and religion to be compatible rather than in conflict. And they don't seem to have difficulty accepting evolutionary science for the most part, right? There'll always be some people who do find it difficult. We even find that for our non-religious participants. But it's not a massive percentage of the population who are finding it difficult to accept evolutionary science, who are seeing conflict between science and religion. So it doesn't seem like this first explanation is really strong enough to explain the really persistent underrepresentation of religious people in science. So next, we want to delve into the second potential explanation, which is that religious people see identifying as both religious and a scientist as surprising or counter-stereotypical. So in this line of research, we wanted to look at how people thought about religious scientists compared to atheist scientists. We wanted to see whether religious scientists were viewed as being more counter-stereotypical or more surprising than atheist scientists, and then flipping that around to see whether the combination of religious and scientist identities was less intuitive for people than the combination of atheist and scientist. So looking at it from both directions, so counter-stereotypical and then intuitiveness, so that we can kind of, address the same kind of issue from different sides. And then we also wanted to look at whether people's own religious or non-religious social identities affected their perceptions. So we looked at, we compared people, this was all done in the UK, who were religious versus atheist versus that kind of other non-religious category. So non-religious, but not atheist. So the first study I'm going to show you, we used emergent attribute analysis. So emergent attributes happen when someone contradicts what we expect. So normally, when we encounter a new person, for example, and they fit our general stereotypes, we just describe them with words that kind of relate to one of those two identities. So for male mechanic, for example, you might describe this person as strong and tall, which are associated with male, and you might describe them as skillful and maybe having greasy hands and things like that, right, which are associated with the word mechanic. But when somebody breaks our stereotypes, like our normal combination of identities, what we expect from someone, we tend to change how we inform our impressions about that person. And we use emergent attributes. So these are attributes that are unique to a combination of identities that are surprising or contradicting in our minds. So we have to use our causal reasoning to make sense of these two identities. So for example, for a female mechanic, you might come up with these types of attributes to describe them, which are not related to the initial two constituent identities of that combined identity. So if we, expect that people will find a religious scientist to be counter-stereotypical, we would expect that they would be using a higher percentage of emergent attributes to describe that identity combination. And when we did our analysis, that is what we found for our atheist participants. They followed that pattern that we would expect of seeing religious scientists as more emergent or less counter-stereotypical, or more counter-stereotypical than an atheist scientist. But when we looked at non-religious people in this study, we didn't find a significant difference. And for religious people, we actually found that the effect was reversed, so that they actually saw an atheist scientist as being more counter-stereotypical than a religious scientist. So it seems like religious people, at least don't see the combination of religious scientists as being counter-stereotypical or surprising. And I should say we've run this study in several different ways. And it doesn't always come out looking this beautiful as this graph, but you always find a difference for atheists. Sometimes you do for non-religious, where they follow the pattern of atheists. And then for religious people, sometimes they see a religious scientist as being more emergent than, having more emergent attributes than atheist scientists, but you never see it flipped. You never see it in the direction that atheists do, and in the direction that the kind of general conflict narrative about science and religion would kind of indicate that we would. So we wanted to run this kind of general kind of study using a different method, so that we could really triangulate across methods. So what we did for our second study was we presented participants with a vignette of a scientist. So just someone who is generally described as being quite sciencey. And then in the religious condition, we said, Mo, this scientist, is also religious. He believes strongly in God and attends religious services regularly. And then in the atheist condition, we included the sentence, Mo is also an atheist. He strongly believes that there is no God and regularly goes to lectures and discussions about atheism. And then we asked about how surprising this person was, how typical they were of other scientists, and how similar they were to other scientists. And what we found was that for the question about how surprising they were, there weren't really any effects, but there were when we looked at the similarity and typicality ratings, and they were so similar that we just averaged them together. And so what we found was that atheists and non-religious people saw a religious scientist as being less similar or less typical to other scientists than an atheist scientist was. But again, religious participants did not. They did not see a religious scientist as being less typical or less similar to other scientists. And then finally, we wanted to flip this around and look at intuitiveness. So which identities are actually more closely linked in people's minds. So we used an adaptation of the conjunction fallacy task, which is a really standard task used in social psychology, where you present people with a vignette again. So I think this was the same vignette that we used for the previous study. So again, he's just described as being quite sciencey. And then we had people answer 2 questions. So we said, what is the likelihood of the following statements? 1, Mo is a scientist. And 2, Mo is a scientist and is religious. So this was half the participants, and then half the participants did the same for Mo as a scientist and Mo as a scientist and as an atheist. Now, logically, it would always make sense. It would be more likely for somebody to be one thing rather than that thing plus something else, right? So the more that people said that Mo was that thing plus something else, rather than just Mo is that one thing, that indicates that those identities are really closely linked in people's minds, that it's a really intuitive combination of identities. So what we found when we looked at kind of the differences, the different scores here, so we I think subtracted Mo as a scientist and is religious from Mo as a scientist, or the other way around. And what we found was an interaction between the target religiosity and people's own religious identification. So as you can see here for the atheist participants, they saw the combination of religious and evolutionary scientist identities as less intuitive. It was in the same direction for non-religious people. It looks like that's a significant difference, but I guess it's not actually, it's like marginally significant. And then for religious people, again, there was no difference in how they viewed these targets, as we call them in psychology, the person we were asking about. So whether they were in the atheist condition or in the religious condition, we didn't find a difference in how they viewed that person. So as you can see, similarly to the previous study, we're just not finding for religious people that there seems to be an understanding that, the combination of religious and scientist identities is less intuitive or more surprising. So across these different studies and different methods that we used, it really seems like religious people are not viewing religious scientists as being more counter-stereotypical or less intuitive. So I think we can cross this potential explanation pretty safely off the list here. So now I'd like to go to the final potential explanation for underrepresentation, which is that the culture of science is discouraging religious individuals. So I'm going to talk about kind of 4 related areas here. The first is stereotypes. Then I'm going to talk about projection and counter-projection, role models, and belongingness. So on to stereotypes. Previous research has shown that religious individuals tend to be stereotyped as being less intelligent and less competent in science This has primarily been done in the US. And my amazing colleague, Kim Rios, and her colleagues have looked at stereotype threat for Christians in science, or if you just have people do a task that you say is a science task, Christians will do just as well as everybody else. But when you make them aware of stereotypes about Christians being less competent at science, or you make them aware of the kind of conflict narrative about science and religion, they tend to do worse on those science-related tasks. So there's a threat of that stereotype that is affecting people's performance when it's made salient for them. And Kim also, with one of her postdocs, did a really interesting study of social scientists themselves and found negative stereotypes associated with research about science or about religion and spirituality, and researchers who study religion as well. So they're seen as being less rigorous and that kind of thing. So there seems, even within the social sciences, to be a bias against the study of religion even. So, like I say, we know quite a bit about stereotypes of religious people, especially in the US, but we wanted to look at this kind of more global scale. What kind of stereotypes do people really have about religious people, and are they stable across country contexts? So we did some research in our SRS2 project, asking about what kinds of different stereotypes are describing kind of social identities that are relevant to the conversation about science and religion. So in the UK and Germany, we used those same identities for our participants that we did in previous research. So we did religious, non-religious, and atheist. In Spain, after we'd run our initial studies, we talked to our colleagues on the ground, and they said, really, you need to split out the religious group into practicing Catholic and non-practicing Catholic, and then keep the non-religious and atheist identities. So apparently practicing and non-practicing Catholics are even, tick boxes on demographic forms in Spain. They're very recognized categories in the culture. And again, shows the importance of having local knowledge, and people who are experts in the field where you're doing your research. In Argentina as well, our colleagues suggested, coming out of the research that they'd been doing, that there seemed to be distinctions between Catholics and evangelical participants. So we asked, so we had those, we split the religious category in Argentina into Catholic and evangelical, and then had the original non-religious category. And then in Sri Lanka, unfortunately, this time we could only get a general population. We couldn't look at different religious identities. So what did we do? We asked people with these different identities whether various stereotypes described relevant social identities, and we used those same ones. So people were answering for their own group as well as for these other groups. And then we also added in the identity of scientist into all of these contexts as well. So we wanted to see how these stereotypes of different identities related to religion and non-religion also related to stereotypes about scientists. And we asked about a whole lot of different words. I'm not going to bore you with all of them. It would also take longer than this presentation to go through all of them. So I'm just going to present the results for the term scientifically minded, which I think we can all agree is very relevant to conversations today. So in the UK and Germany, we found very similar patterns. Sorry, there's a lot of bars on these graphs. I'll just talk you through them briefly. I think the most important thing to see, first of all, everybody sees a scientist as the most scientifically minded. Makes sense. And it's a good manipulation check for us, really. But as you can see, there's a clear distinction between the religious group on the left and the non-religious and atheist groups on the right of both of these graphs. Religious people are not distinguishing between the different social identities, so religious, non-religious, and atheist, in terms of whether somebody with that identity would be described as scientifically minded, but non-religious and atheist people are. So they're saying that a religious person would be described as less scientifically minded than a non-religious or an atheist person. In Spain and Argentina, we found fairly similar results. Again, you can see the bar on the very right for all of these, the scientist bar. Scientist is described as the most scientifically minded. And you can see, so they're in a slightly different order here. Apologies for that. The atheist and non-religious groups for Spain on the left here are actually in the middle of that graph. And you can see they have very similar patterns. So they view the practicing Catholic as the least scientifically minded, the non-practicing Catholic as the second least scientifically minded, and then they're not distinguishing really between the non-religious and atheist identities. The practicing Catholic, it looks like there might be a difference between some of these, but really they're very small differences. So I think we can safely say that they're not really distinguishing between any of these religious groups. And then for the non-practicing Catholics on the very right of this graph, you can see that they're making a clear distinction between the practicing Catholics as being less scientifically minded, and then their own group, the non-practicing Catholics, are the same as the non-religious and atheists in their mind. So they're all viewed as being equally scientifically minded. In Argentina, on the right here, again, we find that non-religious people are actually just viewing both of the religious targets, so Catholics and evangelicals, as being less scientifically minded. And actually, weirdly, in Argentina, it's the one context in which we found that religious people were also saying that their own religious groups, their own group and the other religious group were less scientifically minded than non-religious people. So it seems like there might be a slight difference in the narratives about stereotypes of religious and non-religious people in Argentina specifically. And then for Sri Lanka, again, this was just a general population. It was primarily Buddhist in this group. And as you can see, the Buddhist graph, other than scientists, is actually the highest in terms of saying that they are scientifically minded, but there's not a huge difference here in the different religious groups. So again, it's hard to directly compare this to the other contexts because, again, we don't have a non-religious category here. We also weren't, asking about people with asking participants with different social identities to answer this. But it is interesting to have this data and to kind of get a sense of what stereotypes might be in other country contexts that aren't normally studied. So it seems like across most of these groups, at least, that amongst non-religious people, there is a sense of religious people as being less scientifically minded than non-religious people. And that seems to be relatively consistent across the different countries that we've looked at. So again, this kind of ties into this larger global issue of underrepresentation of religious people in science. Okay, so next I'd like to talk about projection and counter-projection. So projection is when people tend to project their own beliefs onto other people, so think that they have the same beliefs if they are similar to me. And also recent research is absolutely fascinating and came out after we were puzzling to make sense of our results. So it was really helpful. This research shows that people tend to counter-project onto antagonistic or oppositional others. So they'll think that those people actually have the opposite beliefs to them. So what we wanted to do was look at the relationship between people's own ability to reconcile evolution and their personal beliefs, and how easy or difficult they thought somebody with different identities would find it to reconcile evolution and their personal beliefs. So here on this table, you can see for our agnostics, we find positive correlations, so that's evidence of projection for the kind of neutral targets of person on the street and evolutionary scientist, and for the kind of semi-in-group target of atheist for agnostic people, so similarly non-religious at least. For religious people, we found a significant positive correlation, so indicating projection just for the religious target here. But again, that's in the expected direction, right? Atheists are actually very interesting because what we find is a positive correlation in terms of their in terms of in-group targets and neutral targets, so the person on the street, evolutionary scientist, and atheist, but actually a reverse, so a negative correlation for religious people. What this means is that the more an atheist finds it easy to reconcile evolution and their personal beliefs, the less they think a religious person can reconcile evolution and their personal beliefs. So you're finding this kind of oppositional aspect here. And I know I'm kind of running low on time, so I'm just going to really speed through a mediation model looking at how this is important, why this is important, basically, because what we find is that this predicts people's in-group preference for atheists. So atheists preferring atheists over religious people is predicted by both in-group and out-group prototypicality. So this is the extent to which there's like a difference between a general target of a person on the street and their in-group and a general target person on the street and their out-group. So essentially what this means is the more I think my group is better and their group is worse at this thing, the more I prefer my my group to them, right? So the more I prefer atheists to religious people. So it seems like in addition to just showing that there is some projection and counter-projection going on in terms of people being able to reconcile evolution and their personal beliefs, there's also an impact in terms of people's attitudes towards other people. So it's really kind of indicates just how important it is to kind of puzzle through these things. Okay, just briefly, I'm going to talk about role models as well. So the question of whether people have role models of scientists who are religious to look up to. So we see this a lot with regards to women in STEM fields and the need to have role models for women. But what's the situation for religious scientists? Well, what we find is that honestly, nobody can really think of religious scientists when we ask them to list the number of atheist scientists and religious scientists that they can think of. But atheists in particular are able to think of a lot more atheist scientist examples. So it really seems like there might be a lack of religious scientist role models or exemplars in society. And additionally, it's really interesting to look at who people actually write down when they write down, which scientists they can think of. So notable atheist scientists all really tend to be modern. Notable religious scientists primarily tend to be historical or anecdotal, like, my grandma was a religious scientist or something like that, right? But in terms of public figures, they all tend to be historical. There were some scientists where there wasn't really much consensus. People didn't really know whether Darwin or Einstein were religious or atheist. And then just highlighting the fact that this is not just an issue to do with religion. There were almost no women mentioned at all. The only two were Marie Curie and Florence Nightingale, and they were not mentioned very much. So, again, not just a problem for underrepresentation of religious people in science, shall we say. All right, so the final point I want to make before we open this up to the chat is one about just kind of a general sense of belongingness. So do religious people feel like they truly belong in science? Is it a welcoming place for them? There seems to be an assumption of non-religion in science across quite a bit of research that's been done. So Eklund and Park's research on elite scientists, for example, found that although the majority of people didn't see science and religion as being in conflict, a lot of them actually thought that their colleagues saw conflict, right? They thought that their colleagues were positive towards religion. So it indicates that, like, even when individual people might not be hostile towards religion, the culture of science might be seen as being hostile. Additionally, my colleague Rebecca Cato, who's been part of the SRF projects on the qualitative side, has done research on scientific workplaces and found that being non-religious was just kind of an assumed norm, and that you had to kind of carefully manage any kind of religiosity so that you didn't make it seem like it was interfering with your credibility as a scientist and that kind of thing. We have some data to back this up as well from our project. In one of the studies, the vignette study that I mentioned a long time ago, where people read a vignette of a scientist who was either described as being religious or atheist, and then answered some questions about how typical of other scientists that person was, that kind of thing. We also asked how well respected they were of other scientists. And what we found was that all participants, independent of their own religious identity or non-religious identity, viewed religious scientists as being less respected by other scientists than atheist scientists were. So there's just general assumption that a religious scientist is going to be less respected by their peers. Additionally, we did a study where we had people read different statements by Richard Dawkins, one that was more confrontational, one that was less confrontational. And what we found was that particularly religious individuals who read a more confrontational statement by Richard Dawkins were subsequently lower in personal identification with science than those who read the less confrontational statement. So, you know, it really seems like the kind of hostile messages about religion and science can have a real effect on religious individuals. So what can we say about this then, this kind of program of research that we've done? It really seems like religious individuals are not disengaging with science because of either a personal belief that there's a conflict between science and religion, or because of viewing the religious scientist identity as somehow being problematic. But I think that there is some pretty good evidence that religious people might be disengaging from science because of a perception that the culture of science is hostile. So we've seen, you know, evidence of negative stereotypes about religious individuals in science, counter-projection of perceptions of conflict onto religious individuals by atheists, a lack of role models who are religious scientists, and just kind of a general sense of lack of belonging and respect and feeling welcomed in science. So the question then that, you know, we all need to go away and think about is how to make science a more welcoming environment for religious individuals. There have been a lot of interventions that have been developed for, you know, gender and STEM, for example, like how to get more women into the sciences. So we don't necessarily need to start from scratch even, but, you know, thinking about how we might develop kind of bespoke interventions to kind of help to address some of these issues, particularly related to the culture of science, would be a good next step, I think, as well as thinking about this in an intersectional way, right? So I've mentioned this a couple of times that, you know, we really need to think about the intersection of different kinds of identities. So it's not just religion, it's also gender, ethnicity, people's socioeconomic background, those kinds of things, which might have their own implications for underrepresentation in STEM as well. So it's a pretty complicated picture, but one that I think would be beneficial for us all as a society to think about. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much. I just want to put a quick link to the website for my project, International Research Network for the Study of Science and Belief in Society. We have a really large network of people doing research on science and religion, science and belief in lots of different contexts around the world. I also currently have a study that is live. So if you are a religious scientist living in the UK and you would like to participate in my study, I'm looking at kind of bicultural identities as being religious and a scientist. Please do help me out and share that link as well with any colleagues you think would be interested. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Carissa. Virtual round of applause. Absolutely, I think the work that you're doing is fascinating anyway. And I've got some questions, but Paul beat me to getting his hand up first. So, Paul, I will let you go first.
Hello. I think I've already participated in your recent one. Of Methodist ministers, did it come through to? Well, it came through me on the internet anyway.
We shared it via.
Oh, you shared
SRF,
it. It was that was the route. Yeah, I'm a retired Methodist minister who's a scientist.
Great.
And so I had a career like this. When I went for my Viva for my PhD, I was greeted by a particularly anti-Christian professor, who I knew was, who greeted me by saying, what are you here for? Because I was then in Germany doing postdoc. I said, I've come from Viva. Why wasn't I told? He said, I'd have stopped it if I'd known. That was Aberystwyth. This is going back to 1978.
Wow.
But the microbiology professor knew that, so it was all done in the other department. But we met that. I knew that was the case. I did postdoc in Germany, which I found different. I didn't find the same conflict in, but then becoming a Methodist minister, studying and doing theology, that was also interesting because there were converse ones. I did a theology degree at Durham, and I do remember some hostility. And I also remember being, at one point, I was responsible for doctrine in the Methodist Church. And a certain professor, well, I won't go into details, but an eminent theologian looked at me and I said, well, look, I'm a scientist who does theology. And the response was, you could be a proper theologian, which was an interesting comment from somebody with a very eminent position. My questions are, I think, were twofold. One is there a difference in age groups? Because I find it less prominent now than I did then. When I retired, the Royal Society of Biology said, is it you? And I said, yes. And they asked me to be on the committee of the North of England. And then they said, why aren't you a fellow? Well, when I went into the ministry, I think they thought I'd flipped. And it was actually, we're going to make you one from Monday. You did it all 30 years ago, which is an interesting response. There's a change. So I see a change in age group. The other thing I found as a minister was particular, if you like, flag bearers for groups, particularly in churches. Those I've met it here already, and both in science and religion, who demand the identity of the group, and they take an extreme view. So we are people who don't believe in science, aren't we? And you go to a church. I met this. I took a service at a particular church in County Durham. And a particular person was very offended I had a BSc. Actually, the rest of the congregation weren't, but he was the one who launched. Yeah. And equally, I remember a Royal Society of Biology meeting. Just one person attacked me. You can't be both. You're dishonest. That was an ecologist in his 80s. Yeah. Said I couldn't be an ecologist and a Christian. So the two questions are really the particular flag bearers who are preserving the identity of a group and are being loud about it and saying you can't be in this group if, so the other people are very quiet. I was superintendent at Birmingham West Norbury until 5 years ago, so that patch. And I had particular churches where people said, and there were also ethnic aspects to this, we are the people who don't believe in Darwin, do we?
Yeah.
And the other one is age.
Yeah, I think both of those play out. I don't necessarily have data that would speak to that directly at the moment, but I do think one thing we've really noticed in kind of our research across all the different strands of research that we've done is this kind of amplification of the loud voices, right? So I think this is in media as well, right? So like if there's a topic on science and religion, it's going to be on conflict because that's what sells, right? It's what gets people fired up, and it's what sells, and it's what's kind of like and what people have these really loud voices about, where the vast majority of people are somewhere in the middle. It's not something that they think about on a daily basis. It's not something that they get really fired up about, but it's those loud voices which are amplified. And I think that that holds true for the culture of science as well. You know, as you know, we've seen from Elaine Eklund's work, the majority of scientists don't see conflict between religion, but obviously there are these loud voices, you know, the problematic professor who is going to make trouble for everyone, even if they're not in his department at the university, right? So I think that that kind of issue of whose voices are being amplified versus the kind of representativeness of those voices are kind of really important. And it's important to grapple with them, certainly, but I think it's also really useful just to point to the fact that those are not the majority, right? And then I also think, again, it's something I don't have evidence for, but it's a theory that I have, which is that I think non-religion, because it's becoming more normative in the UK, is becoming less of something that people need to fight for. And I think that that could be contributing to the kind of lowering of the temperature of these kinds of debates over time. Because I think that, you know, when you have a really kind of minority identity, a lot of times you really need to kind of build up like an idea of like a strength of identity in that, in order to kind of maintain it and in order to kind of like distinguish it from other identities and those kinds of things. Whereas if it just becomes kind of more of a societal norm, it's not something that needs to be fought for in the same way. So I'm wondering if that might be what's going on in terms of generational differences and how people are talking about these kinds of things.
Thank you.
I'll just say as well, I also have had experiences in both psychology departments and religion departments. And for the most part, these have been really, really positive. I've found amazing people to work with, and it's not been an issue. But I definitely, so I did my master's in religious studies, and I applied to either religious studies or psychology departments, depending on just who I could find to work with, because at the time, there were not very many people supervising PhDs in psychology of religion. And I applied to one university, and I applied to both departments to hopefully do a dual degree, because the professor was dual appointed that I was going to work with. And the psychology department accepted me, even though I had a master's in religion, but the religion department turned me down because they didn't want somebody who was going to be doing quantitative methods in their department. So, yeah.
Thank
so
you.
I definitely think it is on both sides. Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. Luke, I'll come to you in a minute because mine's kind of related to Paul, so I'll take Chair's prerogative. So I suppose there's two. There's a question that I just wondered if you could just offer a clarification for those that are here on what is the difference between non-religious and atheist, or what is the perceived difference between those? I think that might be helpful. And then my question more broadly is there, and you might not have data, it might be something you've kind of gathered through your kind of conversations with people, is there a sense in which you've got any idea about where they see that there might be a conflict, those of faith working in scientific environments, this might just be what your current research is looking at, are more inclined to keep quiet about their faith? And also in relation to that, but also is there any kind of gender difference as well in terms of those that perhaps see a greater conflict? I wonder if that ties in with your intersectionality in terms of underrepresented groups, if that made sense.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. I can answer the last one first, because the answer is I don't know. I talk a good game in terms of intersectionality, but I haven't done it yet in the work that I've done. I think it is a really important issue, but given kind of the scale of the research projects that we had and things, it just wasn't really possible for us to look at it at this point. But I do think it's really important to keep in mind in future. Sorry, your questions have gone out of my head now. Apologies.
one about, oh, now it's gone out of my head as well. Look, it does so yeah, there's the question about the intersectionality. There was also a question around, do you think scientists that have a faith are more inclined to be quiet about it? And then the final one was the definition between non-religious and atheist.
Yes, sorry. Okay. So on the question about whether scientists kind of keep quiet, yes, so my current project is looking at that to some degree, but actually my colleague in Argentina has been doing some really interesting work on this. Arturo Fitzherbert is his name, and he's been looking at kind of, I don't want to say necessarily self-censoring, but like not disclosing religious identities in the scientific workplace. So that's also from the SRF project, but that's from the qualitative side. So he was doing interviews and focus groups with scientists in Argentina and was finding that there. So I would imagine you would find something similar for some people, right? It's not going to be everyone, but I think for some people, that's just something that they don't really want to deal with. So one of the things that I'm looking at is how people manage these different identities, right? So in some cases, like in Argentina, like people even use different languages for work and home, right? Because they often will be speaking English in the workplace and then Spanish at home, for example, in Argentina. And the kind of the extent to which people keep these aspects of their lives separate or they integrate them. And there's a lot of research looking at bicultural, ethnic and national identities that we can kind of use to help us provide some frameworks for how we might be able to kind of understand how people manage dual identities as religious and scientist. So that's the current project that I have going on right now. So if you haven't done the survey yet, please help me out. But yeah, I'm really fascinated by that, like, you know, looking at whether people code switch, for example, those kinds of things.
Thank you. And then, yeah, my final one is the definition. Yeah.
Definition. We didn't provide people with the definition. We just had them self-identify. So we just had a screening question at the beginning of the survey. You know, do you identify as religious, atheist, non-religious but not atheist? So, you know, for example, agnostic or spiritual but not religious or something like that, or other. So people would choose of those four, and then anybody who was other didn't do the survey. And then we had our self-categorized atheist and other non-religious. And that really does a lot of work. I had not expected it to be kind of so helpful in terms of explaining the patterns in our data when I first started this project. But, you know, you can really often see a big difference in the kind of non-religious versus atheist, self-categorized non-religious versus atheist categories. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I'm trying to work out, I won't ask you, but I'm trying to work out if there's an implicit link to people seeing atheist and thinking new atheist. I wonder if that's why it's doing some heavy lifting, but I don't want to bogart your time, so I'll let Luca ask his question.
Yes, thank you so much. Very interesting presentation. I just have a question. In the first part of your presentation, essentially you showed that the religious people don't see like a conflict between science and religion, right? And yeah, I was somehow surprised, and I tell you why. Within religious people, so let's say Christian people, for example, there are those who have certain interpretation of the Bible, which are more, let's say, literalistic. Mm-hmm. They will read, for example, Genesis like in a literal sense, and therefore they will deny evolution. Mm-hmm. And I would have expect that it's important to separate those Christians, for example, that read the Bible in this way. Mm-hmm. That, for example, this would have explained the answer that Paul Beetham had from that friend that said that he shouldn't be an ecologist. Or if you take, let's say, some Catholic people that have follow Fides and Ratio, according to which there is no conflict between science and religion. So within, say, religious people, have you tried to differentiate the two type? Because that would be interesting also for the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back somewhat to actually Finley's question just before, which was about kind of new atheist versus atheist. I think, you know, with these categories, we're using kind of necessarily very, very broad categories just because, you know, it's really difficult with psychological research to go to that really fine-grained detail in terms of like different theological positions and things like that. So that's the beauty of a multidisciplinary project, is I tended to leave those kinds of questions to my colleagues who were doing qualitative research, or the large scale polling where we actually had nationally representative data, because getting, you know, with the way that psychology sampling is done, you know, you'll say, okay, get me 100 people who are religious. A sampling agency will be able to do that. But if you say, okay, I want people who are literalistically religious compared to not, it's quite difficult to get the numbers of people that we would need for our statistical analyses and things like that. We did include some things like religious fundamentalism to try and control for some of these things. But the truth is that religious fundamentalists in the UK are a vanishingly small percentage, you know, so, and of the people who do psychology surveys, even less so. So, you know, we didn't have very many people with those kinds of literalist interpretations in our studies. But that absolutely would be a fascinating topic to look at. And I think looking at gradations, you know, kind of necessarily to make these kind of big picture claims, I've been using these big picture social identities, but I certainly wouldn't say that all religious people are the same or all atheists are the same. You'll find many atheists who are very open to religion, don't see conflict between science and religion, those kinds of things. My supervisor, Fern Elsden Baker, is very clear about this in terms of her atheist identity and supporting research on religion. You know, she's leading 2 massive projects on it, right? So, you know, I just want to kind of underline the fact that there is a huge amount of diversity within all of these kind of broad categories.
Yeah. Paul, have you got a direct response to the Luca Carissa conversation, or is it something different? And you're on mute.
It's just to say, when I've been asked to debate evolution within a church context, in the sort of evangelical side, I mean, in a sense, I would be evangelical in the proper sense of the word. Almost always find that the person opposing me is our scientist. So they don't see a conflict with science. It's very often a chemist who has fundamentalist views, and the audience are saying, actually, we're for science because this is the right science.
Yeah. Thinking about science as not a monolithic identity as well is very important. I think Elaine Eklund as well has done research looking at physicists versus biologists. And I can't remember exactly which way that went, but there was a difference.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I also, you know, I've had various experiences in my life, like describing my research to a friend who was an engineering professor, and him going, well, obviously you can't be religious and a scientist. And I'm like, well, why? He goes, well, I mean, if you believe that the earth was created in 7 days, then how can you possibly, and I'm like, that's such a tiny percentage of religious people who believe that anyway in the UK, you know? So it's kind of a misunderstanding of the category of religious as well. And certainly there could be people who have literalist biblical readings who still identify with science. I'm not saying that they can't, but I'm also saying that there's this kind of misrepresentation of what science is and misrepresentation of what religion is within these conversations a lot of times. Yeah.
I've known a number of very eminent quantum mechanicists who take a very fundamentalist line, Christian line, and being wicked, I was chairing a meeting, one that gave a superb talk, and then I asked him about physics is entirely uncertain, nothing is this, it's all waves and probability. What about your faith? Don't take that away from me. So it's absolutely concrete, as the Bible said. I need that.
Thanks, Paul. I think great points. We're then going to go to John, then Nathan, then Jen. As you get to each other, I've just got to pop off screen for a moment.
Hello. Thanks, Carissa. I've followed much of the research of your book, the big Birmingham projects, and very fascinating it is.
We'll never forget your inaugural lecture for our centre at Newman.
Well, that's very, very kind. You can guess that as a historian, I balk a bit at the idea that categories are necessarily broad, when as a consequence, very critical distinctions often do get missed out.
Yeah.
And I greatly sympathize with Luca's question, because it just seemed to me perfectly clear that if you just try to identify somebody as religious or not, you are going to land in a heap of trouble if you're not very, very careful. And just to illustrate that, it struck me that when you were dealing with role models and the projection, I think there was one where you said that scientists did have a problem when dealing with that question when they came to Darwin and Einstein.
Yeah.
And what I would want to say as a historian is it's a jolly good thing they do, because Darwin was neither religious nor an atheist. And Einstein was certainly religious, but also denied that he was an atheist. So, the real people who inhabit this world don't actually conform usually quite to the classification you need for your analysis. And that just means that a streak of skepticism runs through my own encounter with these particular kinds of sociological survey. I find them interesting. They're very challenging. I just wondered, and I think this would be my question, as I was listening to the first part of your talk, I was asking myself, is any of this really surprising? And I think the question I would still put to you is, what amidst all this plethora of statistical research, what has actually surprised you?
Okay, so first of all, I just need to do a very quick clarification on the role models. We didn't ask people to categorize particular individuals as being religious or atheist. Those were us saying, can you think of any religious scientists? List them. Can you think of any atheist scientists? List them. And then Darwin and Einstein ended up on both lists, on people saying that they were religious and people saying that they were atheist. And I completely take your point that people are complicated. You have entire life histories. I mean, one of the strands of research that we had in SRES was an oral history strand. So my colleague Paul Merchant was going out and doing long form interviews with eminent figures in the field in the UK and things like that. So I definitely take your point that categorization can be problematic. However, I will say that probably the biggest surprise for me personally was how well these categories worked. Because that was not kind of my original approach to the data analysis. I had been much more of a kind of individual differences, how religious are you versus, how non-religious are you, looking at kind of scales of religiosity, those kinds of things. That was my background. And that wasn't really working to help explain the data that we had and looking at, what would predict people seeing more or less conflict and those kinds of things. And it was only from working with my colleague Carissa Sharp, who is a kind of group processes social identity researcher by training, that I learned about kind of looking at the data through this other lens, through the social identity lens, and categorizing people and actually people identifying as a particular group can do a lot of work in terms of explaining these kind of big societal shifts and patterns. So I would say it's certainly not a full picture, and I would never claim that it is. I really want to make that very clear. I'm not saying that all religious people are the same. I'm not saying that all atheists are the same. What I'm trying to show is these kind of general trends that we can find. And yeah, to be honest, I was just very surprised by how well these categories actually worked in the data analysis, because like I say, that wasn't my initial approach to it back in 2014 when we started this research. So yeah, I was as surprised as you, to be honest.
Well, that's a perfect answer to my question. But just if I may, for 1 second, revert to what Paul said about his experience once. I was very privileged to hold a chair in Oxford, which was a chair specifically and explicitly in science and religion. And occasionally I would be introduced to somebody I'd not met before as the professor in science and religion. And on one occasion, but only one over the 7 years I was in Oxford, the answer was, or the response was, "But you can't be," which was very similar, I think, to your experience, Paul, that you recount. There are people, the very, very strongly minded and vociferous, who want the world to fit their oppositional categories. And I think one would say that the person was, what's the word, discombobulated by the fact that I had those two identities in the work that I was doing. So forgive me, that was just a little addition, but it chimed in so well with what Paul had said. There are those, the loud voices, who want it their way. And I'm afraid they do a lot of damage.
I completely agree. Yeah.
Thanks, John. Nathan, you're up.
Let me take the hand now. Yeah. Yeah, hi Carissa, thanks for the talk. Yeah, really, really good to hear. And yeah, generally I think I would certainly agree with the general conclusion in terms of the culture of science and how it might kind of discourage religious groups. And I was going to kind of ask a question then about the groups of religious people that the study looked at. I was going to ask if there's any inclination or future work or current work that's going to look at indigenous or traditional kind of beliefs, because I think in the study so far, what's been looked at is kind of the more major kind of religious groups like Christians and Buddhists, so forth and so on. Like in the kind of 20th century, part of the process of decolonization for many global South countries was like a separation of science and not just religion, but science and indigenous beliefs. And it was part of the process of kind of decolonization for like a lot of global South countries was to adhere to science to make them seem more modern. So I think a part of the whole package of looking at science and religion is to look at science and major religious groups, but also indigenous religious beliefs and how that factors into this whole thing. So yeah, it's just a question about that aspect of things, if if there's any work that is being done or needs to be done in this area from public perspectives or psychological perspectives.
It definitely needs to be done, that's for sure. I'm trying to think of people. I believe Miguel Farias might be doing some work in Brazil with indigenous religion in Brazil, I think. But it's a very understudied area, certainly within psychology. I mean, decolonization in general in psychology is a really kind of important conversation that is not where it is with a lot of other, particularly humanities fields at the moment. So I think that's, so for example, like my colleague Kevin Ladd at the Archive for the Psychology of Religion is very, very passionate about this and is really trying to bring kind of decolonial perspectives into that particular publication. But I would say he's really an outlier in terms of psychology research. It is something that I think, you know, potentially might be better for other methods as well to start out with, rather than necessarily psychology research. I mean, there is a decent amount of psychology research on kind of more indigenous beliefs in cognitive science of religion, for example. But again, not a huge amount. So yeah, I think it's an area that really could use a boost, definitely, especially trying to kind of disentangle conversations about modernity and science and decolonization and all of those kinds of things. I think that would be really interesting, and it might be one of those kinds of questions where it would be beneficial to go in first with those kinds of, you know, actual detailed life stories and interview data and that kind of thing, rather than you know, fill out this scale. Right, you'd have to be really careful about how you did it, right? Because you would want to make sure that you were asking the right kind of questions and those kinds of things. So yeah, it's something that should be done, but should be done with care, I would say, for sure.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks. And Jem, we've got time for you, and then we'll be moving on to the next session. But over to you, Jem.
Right, thanks. Hi, Carissa. Two quick questions. The first one kind of relates back to what Luca was asking about the fundamentalist Christians and so forth. I know Elaine Eklund has done her more qualitative sociological research with elite scientists in the US, but is there anything equivalent to what you've done? I really ought to know the answer to this, shouldn't I? Is there anything equivalent to your work that's done a US population? Because I know you didn't have a US population in your study. And if you did, do you think it would have skewed the results? So that's question one. And question two is about one of your findings. I was quite surprised when you brought the thing that there was actually people thought there was less conflict between science and religion on the human world interaction questions, because I would have thought with health and medicine and things, just for example, from a biblical perspective, how the Bible refers to these things as, you know, either exorcising demons or punishment, you know, poor health being punishment for sin and things like that, that there would have been a greater sense of conflict there. So I don't know if that surprised you or if you have anything to say about that. Thanks.
Interesting. I'll do that one first because I haven't thought about it before. That's very interesting. I don't think I was surprised. I thought it was going to be the big picture kind of questions that you'd see the most conflict around, because that's, you know, kind of evolution in particular is where you see a lot of this kind of stuff happening. And you do tend to see a lot of kind of trust in medical science generally, I think, in the UK at least, as well as lots of other country contexts. So I think potentially this would be another one where you'd really need to kind of dig into that religious category, because I think probably most religious people, this is a guess, I don't know, but I would say most of them are probably not concerned about exorcising demons and things like that. I think that's probably a small percentage of the religious population who probably didn't show up in my survey to a great extent. So I think that that's the kind of thing that you would need to do some really kind of targeted research to try and figure out what's, you know, what kinds of things would be hangups for those folks. When it, you know, it is interesting as well when it comes to the kind of medical stuff. I mean, obviously there was a lot of chatter about the vaccine for COVID when that came up, right? And one thing that's really interesting is that you actually had a lot of people who were like spiritual, or like the spiritual but not religious category, who were vaccine hesitant. So, you know, I think and there's some people doing really, really fascinating research on that category. So I think it's one of these things where you need a bit more kind of careful digging down to try and figure out like which particular groups these narratives are kind of having sway with, and those kinds of things. Sorry, I think you followed up in the chat, so let me see. Yeah, we just asked generally about whether people saw in their personal life or in their personal experience conflict or compatibility between science and religion on those issues. So it might have been down to the question wording where they're like, well, I know some people see this as being problematic, but actually in my own life, I don't. So people might be aware of other people, you know, not wanting to seek medical help or something along those lines, but that they themselves would. So it might have been that that was the reason for that. And then sorry, there was another question, wasn't there?
Just about the difference between Christians in the parts of the world that you surveyed and in the US, and if you thought it might have changed the results.
Yes, well, one of the reasons we didn't do the US is because there's been so much research done in the US. And I think there's a lot of parallels. So for example, I have some really amazing colleagues that I work with in the US who've done some kind of parallel research there and found very similar things. So Jordan LaBeouf, Kim Rios. I will say, I think that there are certain narratives that are a little bit different. So for example, Kim in her research argues that it's really Christianity, which is seen as being kind of counterpositional to science in America, whereas in the UK, and that Islam is not. So Islam is seen as being pro-science, if you will, kind of in the cultural conversation. Whereas in the UK, my colleague Stephen Jones has done a lot of research looking at Islamophobia and science, and he calls it the dinner table prejudice, because it's something that people think is, you know, you can talk about it at the dinner table, really, and those kinds of things. So that kind of narrative about Islam being anti-science seems to be slightly different in the UK compared to in the US. So I think there's some nuances there, but I would say the kind of general trends tend to be relatively similar.
Thanks, Carissa, and thanks, Jen, and everyone else for your questions. And Carissa, thanks for letting us quiz you for even longer and go over time on your quizzing. So really appreciate it.
It's fascinating to hear all of your perspectives. Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it. And hopefully you'll get some, we will share the link to Carissa's research again after the conference as well. So if you are a practicing scientist, or I think you said it's okay if they were a practicing scientist as well, isn't it? So if you were a scientist and are now retired, and funnily enough you have a faith, could you please fill in Carissa's survey for us? I think she'd really appreciate it.